Brest, France, September 1944. A concrete pillbox sits at a street corner in the western districts of the city, close enough to the Atlantic that the crew inside can smell the sea. The position is small and low. Its walls are reinforced concrete, poured by German engineers, to a thickness that no rifle bullet and no ordinary shell fragment could ever trouble. Its single-firing slit looks straight down the length of a narrow street. A machine gun is set behind that slit, laid so that anything moving along the pavement will walk into a stream of fire it cannot escape. This is not an accident of placement, it is the entire logic of the position. The pillbox exists to own that street. The men inside have done everything the German army trained them to do. They are dug into a strongpoint that supports, and is supported by, other strongpoints on the neighboring streets. If an attacker rushes the pillbox from the front, the crew will cut him down in the open. If he tries to slip along the walls of the buildings, another position will catch him from the flank. For 4 years, the Germans had built this kind of defense along the whole Atlantic coast of France, and it had a proven, murderous reliability. A handful of men in concrete could stop a company of infantry in the open. That was the promise the concrete made to the men who lived inside it. And then, without any of the events that were supposed to come first, the promise breaks. There is no infantry rush for the machine gun to answer. There is no rifle section creeping along the wall for the flanking gun to catch. Instead, at the far end of the street, an American armored vehicle noses into view. It is not a tank coming to trade fire. It is a tank destroyer, an open-topped fighting vehicle carrying a long, high-velocity gun, far larger than anything a pillbox was designed to survive. The crew swings that gun onto the pillbox, lays it directly on the firing slit, and fires from point-blank range straight into the aperture. The concrete that made the position invulnerable becomes the thing that seals the men inside with the blast. What was built as a fortress becomes, in a few seconds, a sealed room full of overpressure and steel. American after-action reports describe what typically happened next in these street fights, and the detail is haunting in its consistency. Very often a white cloth would appear at the slit almost at once, but the survivors would not come out. They would not surrender until American infantry walked up to the ruined position and physically pulled them from it, dazed, deafened, unable to understand what had just occurred. Their fortress had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had dominated the street, and they had died, or nearly died, regardless, killed by an enemy who used their own street against them. This scene repeated itself across Brest through the late summer of 1944, and the German confusion recorded afterward is the puzzle at the center of this story. These were not second-rate troops. Many of them were elite paratroopers. Their fortifications were among the strongest in France. Their doctrine was the product of centuries of siege warfare, refined by the most methodical military engineers in Europe. By every rule they had been taught, a fortress like Brest should have cost the Americans a long, grinding, conventional siege, measured in months and in enormous casualties, if it could be taken at all. So why did the same fortress logic that had bled the Allies elsewhere, defended by good soldiers in excellent concrete, collapse so completely once the Americans decided to reduce it? The answer has almost nothing to do with braver American infantry or cleverer tactics of assault. It has to do with a completely different idea about what a fortress even is, and with a small collection of unglamorous weapons that arrived in Brittany that summer more by accident than by any grand design. To understand why the pillbox crews were so bewildered, you have to first take their fortress seriously, because it is the easiest part of this story to dismiss. Brest was not a hasty field position. It was a fortified naval port that the Germans had spent 4 years turning into one of the strongest points on the entire Atlantic wall. When France fell in 1940, the German Navy recognized Brest immediately for what it was, a deep-water harbor on the western tip of Brittany, perfectly placed to send submarines and surface raiders out into the Atlantic to strangle Britain's supply lines. The organization that built Germany's coastal defenses, the organization TOT, poured concrete at Brest on an industrial scale. The centerpiece was a submarine base, a row of pens roofed with reinforced concrete so thick that Allied bombers spent years failing to punch through it. Those pens were the reason Brest mattered so much to both sides in the first place. From this harbour, German submarines had sortied into the Atlantic to hunt the convoys that kept Britain alive, and the concrete that sheltered them had defied everything the Allied air forces could drop. The port that had been a dagger aimed at Britain's lifeline was now a fortress the Allies wanted for their own supply, and the Germans were determined that if they could not keep it, no one would use it. Everything hard about the coming battle grew from that concrete, poured in the peacetime confidence that it would never be attacked from the land side at all. Around that naval heart, the Germans built a defense in depth. They did not have to start from nothing, because Brest was already an old fortress city. Its core was ringed by ramparts first laid out in the 17th century by the great French military engineer, whose star-shaped fortifications still define the old town. Those walls stood between 25 and 35 feet high in places, backed by earth, fronted by a dry moat, and thick enough at the base that no field gun could quickly chew through them. Scattered around the approaches were old French forts, stoneworks from earlier centuries, which the Germans reinforced with modern concrete, wired, mined, and fitted with machine guns and anti-tank guns. Between and in front of these permanent works, they dug an outer belt of field fortifications, concrete pillboxes, weapon pits, trenches, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and dense minefields, arranged so that every position could be covered by the fire of its neighbours. The genius of it, if that is the right word, was economy. The German commanders understood that they would be outnumbered and outgunned in the air and on the ground. So they built a system in which a very small number of men could impose an enormous cost. A single pillbox with interlocking fields of fire could pin an attacking battalion in the open and hold it there while mortars and artillery, ranged in advance on the killing ground, did the rest. The defender traded mobility for permanence. He agreed to be fixed in place, unable to maneuver, in exchange for the power to make the ground in front of him lethal. Against an attacker who played the game the fortress was built for, an attacker who advanced with infantry into that prepared ground, the trade was a good one. This was the same bargain that had made German defence so deadly across the whole Normandy campaign, in the hedgerows and the fortified villages, where a few determined men and a machine gun had repeatedly halted forces many times their size. If detailed history like this is the kind of thing you value, the forgotten engineering and doctrine behind what actually happened in these battles, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of work reach more people who care about getting the story right. By the summer of 1944, the German High Command had turned this defensive logic into a formal and fanatical doctrine. As the Allies broke out of Normandy, Adolf Hitler designated a series of ports along the French coast as fortresses, in German, Festungen. The word carried a specific and deadly meaning. A fortress commander was ordered to hold his port to the last man and the last round, and he was forbidden to surrender. The strategic reasoning behind the order was cold, and on its own terms, not stupid. The Allied armies pouring across France ran on a river of supplies, and that river had to come through ports. Planners had estimated that the Allied divisions on the continent would need on the order of 26,000 tons of supplies every single day. If the Germans could deny the Allies the great harbours, or hold them long enough to demolish them beyond use, they could choke the Allied advance and buy time for the German homeland. Every soldier tied down besieging a fortress port was a soldier not driving toward Germany. Every ton of ammunition fired into a fortress was a ton not landing on the Reich. Command of Fortress Brest fell to General der Fallschirmtrooper Hermann Bernhard Ramcke, a hard, aggressive paratroop veteran who had fought in Crete and in North Africa under Rommel, and who was, by every account, a committed and unyielding Nazi. Ramcke took over the fortress in the second week of August, with his predecessor, Colonel Hans von der Mosel, staying on as his chief of staff. The core of Ramcke's garrison was his own 2nd Parachute Division, some of the finest light infantry Germany produced, stiffened by soldiers of the 343rd Infantry Division, remnants of other broken units, and thousands of Navy and Air Force personnel pressed into the ground defense. The Americans, going in, believed they faced perhaps 16,000 men. The true number was closer to double that. By the end, 38,000 Germans would go into captivity at Brest. Ramcke embraced the fortress logic completely. He had the French civilian population forced out of the city, both to keep them from interfering with the defense and so that his garrison would not have to feed them, ensuring the food and ammunition stocks went entirely to fighting men. He arranged his defenses exactly as the doctrine prescribed: an outer belt to break the first assaults, an inner belt of permanent works around the old city and the naval base, everything sited for mutual support, everything designed to draw the attacker into a slow, bloody, house-by-house fight that would burn through American lives and American time. He was not planning to win. He was planning to make the Americans pay a price so high and for so long that the effort itself would serve Germany. Within that plan, the pillbox on the street corner was doing precisely its job. Picture how the system was meant to work, and had worked before. An attacking force approaches the outer belt. It cannot see most of the defenders, who are dug into concrete and camouflaged positions. As the infantry advances into the open ground between the hedgerows and the strongpoints, the forward pillboxes open fire, and the attack goes to ground. The moment it does, German mortars and artillery, already ranged on that exact patch of ground, drop a curtain of fire onto the pinned infantry. To take a single strongpoint, the attacker must cross a beaten zone under interlocking machine gun fire, then somehow get close enough to a concrete position to do it real harm, all while being shelled. Historians of the Brest fighting describe defenses in which the strongpoints were placed to funnel any attacker into precisely these kill zones, with the whole apparatus intended to bleed the assault white and then swallow the survivors in street fighting. The elegance was that a thin crust of men in concrete could hold up a force many times their number, and every hour they held was an hour won for the strategic plan. There is a reason this battle, and this German near success, gets so little attention today, and the reason is straightforward. History tends to be written around the campaigns that decided the war, and Brest did not decide anything. It was a backwater, 300 miles behind a front that was racing east toward Germany. Worse, from the Allied point of view, it turned out to be strategically pointless, and nobody likes to dwell on a battle that cost thousands of lives for a prize that proved worthless. So the siege of Brest slipped into the footnotes, overshadowed by the liberation of Paris, by the great pursuit across France, by the airborne drama of Operation Market Garden in Holland that was unfolding in the very same weeks. But if you look narrowly at the contest itself, at the specific problem of how you break a modern fortress held by elite troops, Brest is one of the clearest laboratories the war produced. And within that laboratory, for the first weeks, the fortress was winning. It is important to be fair to the men who defended it, because the resolution of this story only makes sense if you understand that they were not fools and their fortress was not weak. Ramcke's paratroopers were genuinely dangerous soldiers, aggressive, disciplined, and skilled in exactly the kind of close, stubborn defense the terrain demanded. Their fortress doctrine had a distinguished pedigree and a recent record of success. Only weeks earlier, other German garrisons had shown what fortress ports could do. At the fortress of Saint-Malo, further east along the Brittany coast, a German garrison under a determined commander had held out through most of August against the American 83rd Infantry Division, forcing a costly reduction and thoroughly wrecking the small port before the end. On an island off Saint-Malo, a German strongpoint held out even longer, surrendering only after days of heavy shelling and air attack. Before that, at Cherbourg in June, the Germans had demonstrated the other half of the fortress bargain, holding the port long enough to demolish its harbour so completely that the Allies needed weeks to make it usable at all. The pattern was consistent and, from the German side, encouraging. Fortress ports imposed delay, imposed casualties, and denied the enemy his prize. Everything Ramcke knew told him Brest would do the same. Ramcke himself embodied the confidence of that tradition. He had risen from the ranks in the First World War, become a paratrooper late in life, and made his name in the airborne assault on Crete and in the Desert War in Africa. He was decorated, respected by his men, and utterly committed to the fight. His paratroopers shared that spirit. German airborne infantry had a fearsome reputation earned across the Mediterranean and Italy, and even fighting now as ground troops in a doomed fortress, they were among the most tenacious defenders the Americans met anywhere in the West. When such men told you a fortress could hold, the claim carried weight, and the recent evidence agreed with them. At Cherbourg, back in June, the German commander had surrendered only after his engineers had turned the finest harbor in the region into a wrecked and mined ruin that took the Allies weeks of frantic salvage to reopen even partially. The fortress bargain was not a theory to these men. They had watched it work. The American command, at first, seemed to confirm his expectations by handing him exactly the kind of fight his fortress was designed to win. The task of taking Brest fell to the United States 8th Corps, under Major General Troy Middleton, part of the great American force that had broken out of Normandy. Middleton's corps included 3 veteran infantry divisions, the 2nd under Major General Walter Robertson, the 8th under Donald Stroh, and the 29th under Charles Gerhardt, supported by Rangers, tanks, tank destroyers, and combat engineers, some 75,000 men in all. The Americans reached the outskirts of Brest on August 7th, when Patton, hoping to snatch the port by surprise, sent his 6th Armored Division racing ahead. But an armored division could not rush a fortress. The defenses were far too strong, and the tanks were thrown back. Brest would have to be taken deliberately. Taking it deliberately meant first sealing it off, and through the second half of August, Middleton drew a ring around the fortress and cleared the ground on either side of it. The work on the flanks is largely forgotten now, but it was essential because Brest did not sit alone. Its defences reached out onto the peninsulas that framed the great roadstead, and those had to be taken before the city itself could be assaulted. On the Dowlers Peninsula to the southeast, a task force under Brigadier General James Van Fleet fought through a belt of concrete pillboxes, trenches and machine gun nests, clearing the high ground so that American artillery observers could look down into Brest and the anchorage beyond. That fighting alone yielded thousands of prisoners and handed the Americans the commanding observation the fortress had been built to deny them. To the west, another task force pushed out toward the tip of Brittany at Le Conquet, cutting the coastal highway in late August and closing in on a battery of 4 huge coastal guns that could shell the American lines from miles away. Even before the ring closed, the Germans had already lost a chance to make the fortress stronger still. As the Americans raced across Brittany, they had bypassed an entire German division, the 266th, caught out in the open trying to reach the coast. Cut off and exposed, it was hunted down and largely destroyed in the fields of Brittany, its commander taken prisoner by an American artillery unit. Those were thousands of men who never made it inside the walls of Brest to thicken its defense. Nor were the Americans working alone in Brittany. As Middleton's divisions closed on Brest, thousands of armed French resistance fighters, the men of the French forces of the interior, rose across the peninsula. They had spent years in the shadows, and now they came into the open, cutting German communications, ambushing stragglers, screening the long American flanks, and clearing much of the Breton countryside so that the regular divisions could concentrate on the fortress itself. Their local knowledge and their numbers freed American troops for the one task that only heavy weapons could finish: the slow reduction of the concrete. The Americans even tried to talk the fortress into giving up without a fight, and when that failed, to trick it into believing an overwhelming assault was coming. In the days before the main attack, a specialized American deception unit, later famous as the Ghost Army, staged an elaborate bluff outside Brest. Using inflatable dummy tanks, recorded sounds of massing armor played through powerful loudspeakers, and phony radio traffic, they impersonated a far larger force gathering to storm the city, hoping to panic Ramcke into surrender. The deception was skillfully done, and it did draw German anti-tank guns to the threatened flank. But Ramcke was not a man to be bluffed, and the fortress held its nerve. It would have to be broken the hard way. The deliberate assault opened on August 25th and at first, the Americans tried to overwhelm the fortress with sheer weight, the way you might crack a hard target with one enormous blow. The preparation was massive. Waves of medium and heavy bombers struck the German positions by day, and more heavy bombers came over near midnight. Offshore, the old British battleship Warspite, a veteran of both World Wars, arrived off the Brittany coast on August 25th and turned her 15-inch guns onto the German coastal batteries near Le Conquet and Point Saint-Mathieu. In all, some 18 battalions of American Corps artillery, medium and heavy guns, would hammer the defences through the siege. And then, on that first day, 3 infantry divisions attacked side by side. The Warspite that fired on Brest that day was a survivor of an earlier age of war, a battleship that had fought at Jutland in the First World War and had been battered, mined, and bombed across the Second, kept in service now largely as a floating siege gun. On paper, the sheer weight of metal thrown at the fortress that day looked overwhelming. Against dispersed concrete positions, dug into the earth and sighted in depth, it was far less than it looked. Bombing and shelling could churn the surface, cut wire, and rattle the defenders, but the men in the deep bunkers mostly rode it out and came up fighting when the infantry appeared. It failed. The ground attack made very little progress against a defense that was deeper, denser, and far more heavily manned than the Americans had believed. Worse, the offensive quickly ran into a problem that had nothing to do with German fire, and everything to do with the strange strategic position Brest now occupied. The main American armies were 300 miles to the east, and they had first call on fuel and ammunition. Middleton's guns, which had just demonstrated how much shell it took to make any impression on Brest's concrete, began to run dry. The Americans had brought the wrong kind of battle. They had tried to storm a fortress in depth with a single grand effort, and the fortress had done exactly what fortresses do to grand efforts. It absorbed the blow and held. For Ramcke, these first days must have looked like vindication. The enemy had thrown his heaviest punch, and the fortress still stood. This was the siege he had been promised. But the failure of the first assault was not only a matter of German strength, it was also a matter of American supply, and the supply crisis at Brest would end up shaping the whole character of the battle. Middleton had asked for enormous tonnages of ammunition to feed a fortress reduction, thousands of tons to open the attack, and thousands more to sustain it. What he received at first was a fraction of that, because every shell and every gallon of fuel was desperately wanted by the armies chasing the Germans toward the German border. His heavy guns fell silent for want of rounds at the very moment they were most needed. It took the personal intervention of the Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower to raise Brest's priority for ammunition and air support, and only in the second week of September did the fortress finally get first call on supply. That scarcity had a paradoxical effect. Unable to simply drown the fortress in shellfire, the Americans were pushed toward precision, toward using their heaviest weapons deliberately and at close range against specific targets, rather than blanketing whole areas. The rationing of ammunition helped turn a battle of saturation into a battle of demolition. What the pillbox crews could not yet know was that the failure of that first assault did not discourage the Americans into a long conventional siege. It taught them to stop fighting the fortress the way the fortress wanted to be fought. And here, the entire logic of the battle begins to turn, because the Americans were about to bring to bear a fundamentally different idea. The German fortress doctrine, and every conventional besieger for centuries before, had treated a fortress as a place you had to assault, or blockade, or starve, a position from which the enemy fought, and which you had to somehow enter or reduce by maneuver and infantry. The American approach that emerged at Brest treated the fortress as something else entirely. It treated each fortification not as a position to be assaulted, but as a physical object to be destroyed. Not a place to be taken, but a target to be demolished, one work at a time, with overwhelming direct firepower delivered at close range. You did not need to storm the pillbox. You needed to bring a big enough gun close enough to break the concrete with the men inside it. This idea did not spring from a single doctrine or a single genius. It came from the peculiar character of the American Army itself, an army that had learned, through hard institutional habit, to substitute machines and firepower for the blood of its infantry wherever it possibly could. Where the German soldier was taught to make himself and his concrete the decisive instrument, the American system was built to let steel do the dying. And in the summer of 1944, several unglamorous pieces of that system happened to converge in Brittany, none of them designed for the fortress problem, all of them suited to it by accident. Consider the tank destroyer, the very weapon that killed the Pillbox crew in that opening scene. The American tank destroyer branch was itself an improvisation, hastily created in 1941 and 1942 after the German Blitzkrieg terrified the United States Army with visions of massed panzers punching through its lines. The answer the Army devised was a force of fast, lightly armored, powerfully gunned vehicles, whose job was to rush to a threatened point and kill enemy tanks with speed and firepower rather than armor. They trained this force at a new center in Texas under an aggressive philosophy captured in its motto, seek, strike, and destroy. The vehicles that resulted, like the M10 with its 3-inch gun and the faster M18 with a 76mm gun, were open-topped and thinly protected, all offense and little defense, built around a big gun on a mobile chassis. The whole concept had been controversial inside the American Army, and in an important sense, it had already failed on its own terms. The theory held that enemy tank breakthroughs should be met not by friendly tanks, but by these specialized destroyers, rushed to the danger point and massed to blunt the panzer thrust. But the great massed German armored attacks that the doctrine imagined rarely materialized on the Western Front, and when they did, the lightly armored destroyers proved dangerously fragile in the stand-up fight the theory had promised them. By the time of the Brittany fighting, tank destroyer crews across the Army were quietly discovering that their real value lay somewhere the doctrine had never intended. Their guns, powerful and accurate, made them superb direct-fire support weapons for the infantry, ideal for reducing exactly the kind of fixed positions that a tank breakthrough force would never encounter. A weapon conceived for one battle had found its purpose in another. At Brest, that repurposed weapon came into its own. The self-propelled tank destroyers supporting Middleton's divisions were run forward and laid directly on a pillbox embrasure or a strong-point wall, then fired straight into it, over and over. They took up positions from which they could see the German works with the naked eye, and they fired at them point-blank, destroying embrasures, collapsing weapon pits, and blowing apart the concrete positions that no attacking rifleman could have touched. The German fortress had been designed to defeat men in the open. It had no answer for a cannon driven up the street to fire into its own gun slit. Not all of these tank destroyers even moved under their own power. Some of the battalions at Brest fought with towed 3-inch guns, anti-tank pieces hauled into position behind trucks, and then manhandled into the line by their crews. These towed guns were pushed forward into places in full view of the German works, so that their crews could lay them directly on pillboxes, dugouts, machine gun nests and observation posts, and destroy them by deliberate, aimed fire. It was dangerous work, done in the open, within sight of the very enemy they were shooting at, but it reflected the same underlying decision that ran through the whole battle. Rather than send riflemen forward to be cut down as they closed the last yards to a bunker, the Americans brought the gun itself into the open and let it do the killing of the concrete. The crews accepted the exposure because the alternative, feeding infantry into the fortress the way the fortress wanted to be fed, was worse. The American gunners who did this work were methodical about it, and the reports they later compiled read more like the notes of demolition contractors than the accounts of warriors. They recorded which weapons could crack which kinds of concrete, at which ranges, with how many rounds. The lighter guns, the small anti-tank pieces and the standard field howitzers, they found, could rarely destroy a strong bunker outright. Unless a round went cleanly through the firing slit itself, such weapons mostly stripped away the camouflage and chipped the surface, discouraging the fainter-hearted defenders, but leaving the position usable. To actually break a well-built bunker, you needed the heavy calibers, and you needed to place your hits with the deliberation of a stonemason. This was not the chaos and fog of battle as most people imagine it. It was closer to an industrial process, applied to concrete boxes with men inside them. From inside the pillbox, this was an experience the doctrine had never anticipated. A German crew was trained to fight an attacker who exposed himself, an attacker of flesh, whom the machine gun could answer. What arrived instead was a shell heavy enough to shatter their shelter, fired from a range at which they could not miss and could not reply. The American reports on this kind of fighting described the effect on the defenders with grim uniformity. The direct fire pulverized the positions. It did not merely suppress the crews, it broke them, physically and mentally. And as we saw, the survivors would put a white flag out of the slit, but often could not, or would not, come out on their own, so shattered that infantry had to go in and drag them from the wreckage. The mutually supporting design of the fortress, so lethal against an infantry assault, offered nothing against an enemy who simply drove up and demolished each position in turn. But tank destroyers alone were not enough for the heaviest works, and here the American method reached for a second, even heavier tool, one with an origin story as accidental as the tank destroyers. Some of Brest's fortifications had walls of reinforced concrete far too thick for a 3-inch gun to break. To smash those, the Americans brought forward one of the strangest weapons in their arsenal, the M12 gun motor carriage, a self-propelled 155mm gun. Its story is almost comic. The M12 mounted an old French-designed heavy gun, a veteran field piece from an earlier era, onto a tank chassis. The idea had been floated back in 1941, and the Army's Ground Forces Command had at first rejected it as unnecessary. Only 100 were ever built, back in 1942 and 1943, and for a long time they simply sat, used for training, an orphan weapon nobody quite knew what to do with. Then, as the Normandy invasion loomed and the need for mobile heavy firepower became obvious, these forgotten vehicles were pulled out of storage, refurbished, and shipped to France. At Brest, the M12 found its true calling. That massive 155mm gun, run up close to a fortification and fired directly at it, could do what almost nothing else in the American ground arsenal could. It could punch through several feet of reinforced concrete. Firing its heavy shell at close range straight into a bunker, it could crack open works that had shrugged off ordinary artillery entirely. The crews took to calling it the Doorknocker, and the name captured exactly what it did. It knocked down the doors of the fortress. The tests and reports the American gunners compiled on this kind of shooting were precise about the physics involved. Ordinary weapons, the smaller anti-tank guns and field pieces, could strip away camouflage and chip the surface, but rarely destroy a strong bunker. The self-propelled 155 and the very heaviest howitzers were another matter. Fired carefully from close range, they punched into the concrete and gutted the position. What had been an impregnable strongpoint became, after a handful of heavy shells, a broken shell full of stunned or dead men. There was a real art to this kind of shooting, and the gunners worked it out by trial. The heavy shell had to strike with as much velocity as it could carry, so the crews fired at the highest charge, and they fitted special concrete piercing fuses designed to let the round bury itself in the wall before it burst. What mattered most was hitting the same position squarely and again and again. A shell that struck the concrete face at a steep, glancing angle tended to skid away without doing its work, while a square hit drove deep. Firing a short, patient series of rounds into the same spot, a heavy self-propelled gun could bore clean through 6 feet of reinforced concrete. The gun itself was a Spartan machine to operate. It carried only a handful of ready rounds on board and depended on a companion tracked vehicle to haul the rest of its ammunition and part of its crew, and it dropped a great spade at its rear into the ground to absorb the brutal recoil of that oversized gun each time it fired. It was ungainly, obsolete on paper, and precisely the right tool for the one job Brest now demanded of it. The Americans layered still heavier metal on top of this. Corps artillery brought forward 8-inch guns and enormous 240mm howitzers the heaviest mobile artillery the army possessed, and used them in the siege, at times in the direct fire role against the fortress walls themselves. The philosophy running through all of it was the same. Do not send men to do what a shell can do. Do not assault the concrete, destroy it. And through the whole battle, the guns of Middleton's corps consumed ammunition on a staggering scale. Across the siege, American artillery fired something approaching 500,000 rounds into and around Brest. This was the American way of war, reduced to its essence, an almost unlimited willingness to spend steel so as to spend fewer men. Yet even this was not always enough, and the American method's real sophistication lay in what it did when brute firepower alone met its limits. The most vivid proof came at the old city wall. On September 10th, soldiers of the 8th Division fought their way up to the ancient rampart that ringed the old town, the great earth-backed masonry wall standing 25 to 35 feet high behind its dry moat. The Americans did exactly what their doctrine prescribed. They brought heavy artillery up to point-blank range and fired directly at the wall to blast a breach. And for once the method faltered. The direct fire tore gaps in the upper portions of the wall, but could not bring down the massive lower sections or open a gap wide enough for infantry to pour through. The old French engineers had built better than modern gunners expected. The 8th Division, which had taken heavy losses, was pulled out of the line, and the front was narrowed, leaving the 2nd and 29th Divisions to finish the job. It was a reminder that the thickest works could still defeat firepower applied by itself. The answer to the works that firepower alone could not crack was to stop relying on any single weapon and instead integrate everything at once, direct fire, flame, engineers and infantry, into a single coordinated act of demolition. Nowhere was this integration shown more completely than at Fort Montbarey, one of the toughest positions guarding the western approaches to the city. Montbarey was an old casemated fort, with immensely thick earth-filled walls and a wide, dry moat, and it had beaten back American attacks. To take it, Middleton's engineers had asked for a specialized weapon the Americans did not themselves possess, flame-throwing tanks. The help came from the British, in the form of a squadron of Churchill Crocodile tanks from a British armoured regiment. The Crocodile was a heavy tank fitted with a flame projector fed from an armoured fuel trailer, a weapon designed precisely for burning out fortifications. The first attempt against Montbarey, on September 14th, went badly. The approach was sown with mines, some of them made from heavy naval shells rigged to detonate under pressure, and several of the flame tanks were knocked out before they could do their work. For 2 days, American artillery, tank destroyers and mortars pounded the fort. Then, at dawn on September 16th, the full integrated assault went in. Under a smoke screen and an artillery preparation, the surviving crocodiles pushed up to the moat and sent their flame directly onto the fort's firing positions, scouring the apertures, while American combat engineers moved in to place a huge demolition charge, thousands of pounds of explosive, against the base of the wall. At the same time, direct fire weapons, tank destroyers, and a light howitzer from the infantry's own cannon company fired at the fort's main gate from a couple of 100 yards, and one gun was reportedly run up to within a few dozen yards to fire directly into the position. Under this combination that no single defense could answer at once, flame at the slits, high explosive at the wall, and shells at the gate, the fort's remaining garrison of roughly 80 men gave up. The commander of the 29th Division credited the flame tanks as an important factor in the capture, but the real lesson was the integration. Each element covered the weakness of the others, and the fortress, designed to defeat any one of them, could not survive all of them together. If you are finding this account worthwhile, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means the next deep dive into the forgotten mechanics of this war will find its way to you. While these set-piece reductions ground forward, the same philosophy was playing out at the smallest scale in the streets, in what the 2nd Division's commander called a corporal's war. Once the Americans broke into the city itself, the German anti-tank guns and machine guns, sighted to sweep the streets, made movement in the open suicidal, exactly as the fortress design intended. So the American infantry stopped using the streets. Instead of advancing down a road into a prepared kill zone, they blew their way through the interior walls of the buildings with satchel charges, moving from house to house through holes of their own making, never presenting the street with a target. Where a pillbox blocked a corner, a small assault team would work its way around and behind it, and burn or blast it out. The official history records one such action in which an 8-man team, carrying flamethrowers, a bazooka, and automatic rifles, made a wide detour to come up behind a concrete strongpoint and flamed it until the defenders, more than a dozen of them, surrendered. The German positions had been laid to dominate the open ground in front of them. They had no good answer to an enemy who refused to appear in that open ground at all, and who came instead through the walls, from the flank, from behind. None of this was cheap for the Americans, and it is worth remembering who was paying. The 29th Division that ground through the western forts had already bled on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June and fought the long summer battle for St. Lo. The 2nd and 8th Divisions were likewise veteran formations that had been in action since Normandy. These were not fresh troops spending an easy victory. They were tired men, many of them survivors of months of the worst fighting in the West, and the fortress killed and maimed them in large numbers, even as their method took it apart. The lopsided prison accounts of the final days should not disguise the fact that the reduction of Brest was, for the men doing it, a slow and costly grind against an enemy who fought to the very end. The flanks of the battle told the same story in miniature. American task forces methodically cleared the peninsulas around Brest, reducing the coastal batteries and outlying forts one position at a time with the same combination of firepower and close assault. On the Leconque Peninsula, where 4 huge coastal guns anchored the German defenses, a tiny American patrol from a ranger battalion, led by a young lieutenant, worked its way into the great battery position and, by sheer nerve, bluffed and forced the surrender of hundreds of defenders. All around the fortress, the pattern held. The Germans held strong positions and made the Americans work, but the Americans kept coming with a method against which strong positions were not enough. The deadlock finally broke in the first days of September, once the new method and a restored flow of ammunition came together. On the eastern side of the fortress, the 2nd Division seized a piece of high ground beyond the airfield that unhinged the German outer line, and from there the pressure became relentless. On September 8th, the divisions attacked in a coordinated push, and this time the outer belt gave way. Hills and strongpoints that had held for weeks fell in a day. In one sector alone, the Americans took close to 1,000 prisoners for only a fraction of that number in their own casualties, a ratio that would have been unthinkable at the start of the siege, and that signaled how completely the balance had shifted. Within a day, leading elements had fought their way to the very edge of the built-up city, and prisoners began coming in by the thousand. The fortress that had swallowed the grand assault of late August was now being pulled apart, position by position, and the Germans could feel it. By the middle of September, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the timing and the cost. On September 13th, Fort Kerenru fell to a battalion of the 29th Division after a sergeant named Sherwood Holman leaped ahead of his stalled unit, and with grenades and rifle fire forced the surrender first of a dozen Germans and then of scores more, an act for which he received the Medal of Honor, awarded after his death in the fighting that followed. Days earlier, in the advance toward the city, a young private named Ernest Prussman had earned the same decoration, also posthumously, leading his squad forward under fire before he was killed. The forts and strongpoints came down one after another, many of them so thoroughly wrecked by shells and bombs that their original shapes were no longer recognizable in the churned ground. By September 17th, the western district of the city had fallen, and only the submarine pens and a last fort still held out. They gave up on the 18th. Most of the garrison surrendered that day, with Ramcke's chief of staff, von der Mosel, surrendering in the west, and a senior paratroop officer surrendering the eastern sector. Ramcke himself did not share his men's fate in the city. He slipped away by boat across the harbour roadstead to the Crozon Peninsula on the far side, where he tried to arrange an escape by aircraft. But American troops of the 8th Division, closed in on his headquarters on September 19th, and he surrendered, on the very day, by grim coincidence, that Berlin awarded him one of Germany's highest decorations for his defense. When an American Brigadier General, Charles Canham, arrived to take his surrender, the proud paratroop general demanded to see the American's credentials, as if unwilling to yield to anyone of insufficient standing. Canham gestured to the exhausted, filthy, heavily armed American infantrymen around him and answered, "These are my credentials." The line became so emblematic that his division adopted it as a motto. Now step back and look at what actually beat the fortress, because the pieces are more revealing together than apart. None of the tools that broke Brest had been created to break fortresses. The tank destroyer had been conceived to kill massed German tanks in a defensive battle that never came, and it was pressed into service as a direct-fire assault gun, almost as an afterthought. The self-propelled heavy gun that cracked the thickest bunkers, the Doorknocker, was an orphan weapon, built on an obsolete gun and an aging chassis, rejected at first as unnecessary and left in storage until the war dragged it back out. The flame tanks that scoured Fort Montbarey were a British specialty, borrowed for the occasion. The engineers, the satchel charges, the massed artillery, the willingness to fire 500,000 shells, all of these were simply the ordinary equipment and habits of an army built to fight with materiel. Not one of these programs had set out to solve the problem of the German fortress. Camouflage and concealment and interlocking fire, the whole apparatus of the defense, had been designed against an attacker who would expose infantry. The Americans assembled, more or less by coincidence of timing, a collection of tools that let them decline to expose infantry and simply demolish the defense as physical material. The fortress problem was not solved so much as bypassed. It stopped mattering. And this is the crucial point about the German failure. It was not a failure of any single component. The Germans had heavy guns of their own. They had excellent artillery doctrine, first-rate engineers, and some of the best infantry in the world. What they did not have was the particular combination the Americans brought: the willingness and the means to run heavy direct-fire weapons up to the muzzle of a fortification and destroy it as an object, backed by a supply of ammunition so lavish that the destruction could be repeated against position after position without pause. Individually, the German army could match most of the pieces. It could not match the integration or the sheer material abundance that made the integration sustainable. Underneath the hardware lay a deeper difference in how the two armies thought, and it is worth stating plainly because it explains more than this one battle. The German way of war placed enormous faith in the individual soldier and the local commander, in initiative, aggression, and the human will to hold a position. Fortress doctrine was the ultimate expression of that faith, a bet that determined men in strong concrete, ordered to stand and never yield, could impose their will on the battlefield by sheer immovability. Hitler's fortress order was that philosophy taken to its fanatical extreme: hold to the last man, because the holding itself had value. The American way of war, by contrast, increasingly treated the individual position as a problem in engineering and logistics, something to be measured, outranged, and destroyed by the application of overwhelming material force, so that as little as possible was left to the courage of the man in the open. One army asked its soldiers to be immovable. The other army arranged never to have to test that immovability with flesh, and to answer it with machines instead. Both were coherent. Both produced excellent fighting men, but only one of them dissolved a fortress in a matter of weeks. So here is the forensic verdict on the Pillbox crew from the opening of this story. The crew did not fail. The machine gun did not fail. The concrete did not fail. Ramcke's paratroopers did not fail as soldiers. They fought with a skill and stubbornness that cost the Americans nearly 10,000 casualties and held a fortress for weeks against enormous odds. What failed was the idea underneath all of it. The idea that a fortress is a place from which you fight, that strength is a property of position, and that an attacker must therefore come into your killing ground and be bled. The Americans refused to accept that premise. To them, a fortress was not a place to be entered. It was a collection of targets to be destroyed with their occupants inside. The German theory said, "If I cannot be reached, I cannot be beaten." The American theory said, "We do not need to reach you, we only need to destroy the thing you are standing in." Both theories were internally consistent. Only one of them matched the enemy who actually arrived at Brest in the late summer of 1944. The final irony is the one that makes the whole battle so strange in memory, and it is worth ending on because it changes the meaning of everything the fortress crews endured. They held. In the one sense that mattered most to the strategy behind the fortress order, Ramcke's men succeeded completely. Their entire purpose was to deny the Allies the port, and in that they were total. Before the end, the German garrison so thoroughly demolished the harbour of Brest, blocking its channels with sunken ships and wrecked cranes, and blasting its facilities, that the Allies never made meaningful use of it. Not a single supply ship of consequence unloaded there in time to matter, and by the time the city fell, the reason to want it had already evaporated. The Allied front had swept hundreds of miles to the east. The great port of Antwerp had fallen to the British on September 4th, with its docks largely intact. Brest, the prize that had justified 75,000 men and 10,000 casualties, was already irrelevant on the day it surrendered. One American official history would call the whole affair bitterly ironical. The Americans had spent thousands of lives to capture a ruin they no longer needed. Historians have argued ever since about whether the whole thing was a mistake. Some contend that once the German front in France collapsed, the Breton ports should have been left alone entirely, masked and bypassed, while every available division drove east to exploit the enemy's disintegration and perhaps shorten the war. Others point out that the decision to take Brest was set in motion earlier, when the ports still looked essential and no one could yet be sure how far or how fast the pursuit would run. What almost no one disputes is the lesson the cost taught. A fortress garrison ordered to fight to the last man and to wreck the port behind it could impose a price out of all proportion to whatever prize was left standing at the end. The Germans had discovered, in the destruction of their pillbox crews, the limits of fortress doctrine as a way of surviving a battle. The Americans had discovered, in the wreckage of the harbour, the limits of fortress reduction as a way of winning anything worth having. The lesson the Allied command drew was immediate and telling. They would not storm the other fortress ports. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, further along the coast, were simply surrounded and left to wither, their garrisons holding out uselessly until the very end of the war in 1945, denied to the Allies but also harmless to them. The costly reduction of Brest had proven that taking a fortress the Germans were determined to demolish was not worth the price. Better to pen the defenders in and walk past them toward Germany. As for the men, Ramcke went into captivity, and after the war he was held for a time, facing charges connected to the conduct of the defense, including the treatment of French civilians and the deliberate destruction of the city, before eventually being released to live into old age in Germany. He never abandoned his conviction that the defense had been worthwhile, that every day he had cost the enemy was a day well spent, for a cause that was, in truth, already lost. The tools that had beaten him scattered back into the general effort of the war. The tank destroyers rolled east toward the German border, where their long guns would again be turned against concrete on the Siegfried line. The Doorknocker guns went on to knock on those doors too, before the whole class of weapon was quietly retired after the war, as newer designs replaced it. The German fortress doctrine, meanwhile, was not so much defeated as revealed. It had been a superb answer to the war everyone expected, and it had met an enemy who quietly chose to fight a different one. And so we come back to the pillbox on the street corner, and to the crew sealed inside it, and now the whole scene reads differently. The machine gun laid down the street was not a mistake. It was the fortress working perfectly, dominating its ground exactly as designed. The concrete was not weak. It was among the strongest in France. The men were not cowards. They were good soldiers doing precisely what their doctrine demanded. What killed them was not a flaw in any of that. It was an enemy who looked at the street their pillbox owned and, instead of walking down it into the guns, simply brought a cannon to the end of it and fired straight into the slit, treating the proud fortress as nothing more than a target with a range and a bearing. The crew died without ever understanding it, because the world they had been trained to fight in did not contain the possibility of dying that way, sealed safe in concrete, undefeated in the open, and destroyed regardless. If this account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. There are many more forgotten battles like this one still to come.